to really expound on the matter. Del, thanks a lot for joining us on Newsnight this evening.
Thank you so much.
Now, it's what's to be understood is this issue around unbundling of Eskom. Does it mean that it is serving a privatization agenda? And exactly what does the privatization agenda actually mean?
And privatization and the unbundling of Eskom is on the cards. As we know, the president has already appointed a task team, which is called the Eskom task team, was appointed in December to provide a report on what should be done with Eskom. That task team has already pronounced its position regarding how Eskom should actually be structured going forward. So when the president came out and said we are unbundling, it was after a couple of consultations with various players, being the ANC, the presidency itself, as well as the cabinet Lekgotla. And in the plan to actually unbundle Eskom was presented. Unbundling simply means that you take a consolidated assets and you put them out together. You put them into units or pieces of each other. So if it's generation, power station generation are going to be put into one aspect of it. If it is to do with transmission, into one aspect. And then if it is to do with distribution, they're going to be put into one aspect. And there was another option which was introduced, which was now the privatization of the sale of electricity, which is called the ISMO bill, as well as the ISMO process, which is how electricity will be sold. So the unbundling simply means that Eskom is going to start looking at itself from a perspective of saying, what is it that we don't need? At this stage, they feel that they want to sell generation units, which is the power stations. And that is the biggest mistake to ever do. And then they're going to leave distribution and transmission.
Why is it the biggest mistake that they could ever do?
The current mistake is to actually take Eskom as it is and try and break it up into units that are not necessary. Eskom is already divided as it is into various operational units, and it has one actually group CEO as well as one group related executive management and board. Whether the board functions is another thing. Whether the executive, sort of CEO, COO, as well as the key people involved in the process know what they are doing is another thing. But Eskom on a daily basis produces electricity. So when you're saying you're going to unbundle and then now start actually looking at assets from an independent point of view with the only interest, which is to sell them, is actually something that we are totally in opposition.
So then when you're saying that it's the whole issue is to sell them, does that then remove Eskom, or the supply of electricity, as a public service, and then it changes it to now a commodity? So we're changing the perspective of the way in which we view electricity, where it's more of a basic human right, and then we're just moving it now to be serving a commodity. It's almost as a price commodity, hence why people need to start paying for electricity, hence why the issue of Soweto even came out in the Soweto townships as well, for the need for them as well to move into actually having the boxes of electricity as opposed to getting it directly from Eskom.
Yeah, Eskom currently already serves the purpose of being a utility for the people. That is why it's called Eskom. It's actually a public entity which is owned by South Africans under the stewardship and guardianship of the government. The state does not own Eskom. The Eskom is owned by the people of South Africa. So in that context, the money to take away is competitiveness of Eskom as a public utility to actually produce, distribute, as well as ensure that they can transmit electricity at a cheapest cost without being forced to be highly profitable, because whatever profits Eskom makes, it reinvests them into operations as well as maintenance and ensuring that Eskom becomes a growing utility provider. You take away that function, you privatize it, which simply means you are now going to have a private company and investors that are going to demand a dividend on an annual basis for whatever money they put into Eskom.
Already with the current financial plan,
and
financial issues that are one can say that are actually surrounding Eskom at this moment.
So when you privatize electricity, you make sure that consumers get to pay more money unnecessarily. Right now, whatever profits are made are reinvested, so the costs are continuously kept low. You cannot privatize a natural monopoly like electricity generation. It is something that most countries regard as one of their key strategic sector that the state looks after and provide that electricity to the people so that the economy can grow and they can produce it for cheap. The minute you make it into a commodity like they are planning to do it, you then create the confusion of market-related interest and profiteering interest, whereby as much as I can charge my consumer, I can get more money so that as a privateer, I make the best money out of it. it. So capital becomes now the critical component rather than the people. And that is why we are opposed to that move. So when
what's
you're
this issue around
unbundling,
full cost recovery? Because it appears as though it's around the mandate of a market logic of full cost recovery. Can you just expand a little bit about exactly?
look, it's all nonsense that they're telling you. Full cost recovery, what do you call it, pass-through, and all of those concepts, and unbundling. Simply just tell people what you're going to do. The concept that I created is actually to confuse, because the same people who are crafting the strategies, you ask them pure logic and sense. What does it mean? Half of them do not even have a cooking clue what they are talking about. So even if you're saying you're rationalizing the assets by separating them and then having a division that only focuses on them, it does not help, because currently Eskom already has that system in place. So why recreate a process that is already in place?
Well, they're in a financial mess at this particular moment in time. So then what would be the alternative that you would recommend or even suggest to the president at this stage, or even the task team that has been appointed to actually make these recommendations? Because if the unbundling is not the way to go, and if privatization is not the way to go, then we need to start looking at an alternative form, because whether or not we like it, Eskom is in a financial pickle at this moment in time. Whether we like it or not, Eskom cannot pay its bills at this moment in time, and we've got load shedding that is being implemented week on, week out. So clearly South Africans here are at the mercy of this power utility. What's the recommendation?
The recommendations are simple. They are maintenance issues related. There is the executive as well as the board. There is the operations on a day-to-day part of Eskom, as well as the aspect of the revenue management. On the revenue management, you start off by saying the suppliers come to the table. Let's start talking on one-on-one basis in terms of how we can make sure that you can supply us at a good price so that we don't hurt the power utility. Secondary to it is all those 50-year agreements that were signed 50 years ago and are currently in existence in Eskom should be completely either scrapped or renegotiated.
Why aren't they scrapped in your opinion? Because I want us to be able to nitpick on certain issues that I think, as you mentioned, the rhetoric to the public is one such. Many will be confused by even this conversation that we're having. So let us bring it down to layman's terms. Why is it that contracts that were signed 50 years ago with an apartheid government with the system of apartheid designed to benefit a minority in this country, including businesses that are owned by a minority group in this country, why are they still in existence today? Why have we not even terminated those agreements?
You see, contracts by their nature are contracts. As long as the people who are in charge are not actually going to change those contracts, nothing will happen. And that is one of the reasons that you have the likes of Brian Molefe as well as Koko Matsela were removed, because they tried rationalizing these contracts and saying, let's renegotiate the prices of suppliers of coal, as well as the, the process whereby they had suppliers who had 40 years to 50-year evergreen agreements. Those evergreen agreements were set in a time that now conditions of the market has changed. We wanted to introduce new black players to make coal supplier competitive. It was not allowed because you had this unnecessary contracts that were set into place. The secondary aspect of it is there's component suppliers. There's boilers, there's turbines, there's piping and all of that. Most of those companies are actually overseas-based companies. None of them are South African-based, and they are supplying these major components.
Do we have the suppliers that are skilled enough, equipped enough to be able to carry out the mandate, especially for supplying to the power utility?
Faith, remember that Eskom was built by South Africans in apartheid days in South Africa under the sanctions days. So the skills and all of this hype nonsense about how Eskom does not have the capability, it's actually misleading to the public, because there are enough necessary skills. 47,000 employees with skills to run power stations and produce electricity on a daily basis. So the whole question of starting to question the capability of Africans, if ever they have the skills, should stop now, because we cannot ever move forward whenever we're being doubted in terms of capability. Skills exist. Engineers are there. Building of these power stations is not a rocket science. I mean, these are fabricated components. These are
not a rocket science, but already they've been admitting that you know, there was a shoddy job done on Kusile as well as the Medupi power stations, where the actual you know, the construction of it is actually contained.
They're lying to you.
I mean, you heard the news, right?
Yeah.
During the week, it was, we do apologize, we do acknowledge that when it came to Kusile and Medupi power stations, unfortunately, it was seen to be low maintenance kind of work and work that was not necessarily up to scratch. And there was an apology, there was issues. So you do not.
So why are we not punishing the contractors? If it was shoddy job, you punish a contractor and you make them pay penalties. Why were there no penalties applied to the contractors, the big EPC companies, Mitsubishi, Hitachi, and the GE, and there are other subcontractors in the process? Because those are the people that should have been put onto the process and say, listen, you have given us shoddy work, and I'm a customer on this one side. I'm paying for the value that I've invested in this process. So you give me the product that I've requested. Whether you made a shoddy job or not, penalties should be applied. Why are there no penalties towards these companies? Why is Eskom not clawing back on the delays? I mean, it's 10 years. 2007 was the start from the build program.
Yeah.
Today we're sitting with over 400 plus billion worth of something that was supposed to have been built for 70 billion. What is going on? The answers are simply that there was mismanagement, there's been a lot of corruption, there's been a lot of stealing of state resources, there's been a lot of unnecessary delay of these build programs. And the current political establishment has not been honest about the truth. They've been very, very, very...
So what is the truth then?
The truth is there's a money-making scheme. Kusile is a money-making scheme. Medupi is a money-making scheme. Ingula. The power stations, the suppliers of all those power stations are making a lot of fortune out of it. These are listed companies on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. You go to the JSE Mott Street in terms of the foxes and wolves of Mott Street. Are making a fortune out of Eskom. And this fortune is not translating towards our developmental agenda as a society and as a country. And this is what is causing the problem. ANC, unfortunately, knows the problems, but is not prepared to confront white monopoly capital and its interest on safeguarding the profits that are actually destroying the state.
So you're saying that by actually unbundling, would we not say, and look, and I'm playing devil's advocate with this interview, but would you not say with this conversation that unbundling aims to actually address the very same issues that you're putting forward at the table, that by us or by the recommendations to unbundle Eskom, that it is trying to deliberately, number one, root out corruption? Look, you may laugh as it may, but
sure,
these are the interpretations of the public at large. So we need to understand when we're taking conversations around unbundling, and the task team has been actually devoted to making sure that those recommendations are put forward, are those recommendations then put forward to address the very same issues that you've got a problem with? Those 50-year contracts, those issues around maintenance.
The unbundling process with the task team was actually quite a very bizarre process. It took 6 weeks for this task team to give us a report. We haven't seen the report, but they have briefed the president about the outcome of the task team. Not only that, they have made recommendations that unbundling should be the process. How long does it take to go and actually assess power stations that are under a South African environment whereby Eskom has over about 20 plus power stations? Did they go on each individual power stations and assess as to what is currently available in terms of asset? What can we do with this particular power station? What can we do with that particular power station? Instead, they just went straight to a textbook desktop report that was already prepared when we had the previous load shedding under the war room. And they pulled that document and said, let's flip it around and then present it, because now this is our time to can push the privatization agenda. And in that privatization agenda, we want XYZ. Half of the people who are sitting on that particular task team have an interest in buying Eskom's power stations. So they said, look, as soon as we can get this process before elections.
Who are those people?
In 2019. I mean, you have people like Professor Eberhard who are sitting on the task team. You had people like who have already been recommended. So these are people whose interest has nothing to do with South Africa's energy sector in terms of its integrity and retaining South Africa's sovereignty. They are interested in letting it go towards foreign interests, being funded by foreign banks, being owned by foreign entities, and making sure that South Africa's energy sector is completely privatized into foreign hands, which means as ordinary South Africans, we're going to be in trouble because we'll have to buy our electricity from Germany.
So then how do South
countries.
Africans start taking back? Because when we started this conversation, you made it quite clear that Eskom is an entity of the people. It belongs to the people. It is not necessarily, it is a state-owned enterprise, but ultimately its accountability rests with the people. Then how do the people take back their power? And this is just considering what happened when prepaid meter boxes were being introduced in Soweto, and people went on a rampage. There was some violence. But how then do people take back that power and say, Eskom, surely we can start interrogating other alternatives instead of unbundling, which will then serve the interest, as you are mentioning it, serve the interest of the few who actually want to benefit from privatization?
The people's power has already been demonstrated. The president has already pulled back his statement in the same week, this week. He said we are unbundling and no longer unbundling, but we are actually turning around Eskom. Unbundling does not mean we are privatizing Eskom. And all of these confusing messages, it means that the people's actually will has already been heard. We are sitting here as part of representatives from people-related bodies, civil society, political parties, and we are saying that we are not going to allow a situation whereby as ordinary citizens and South Africans, we are not even consulted. Remember last year, the Parliament Committee recommended the Minister of Energy to do a public indaba on the issue of energy and what should be done with the South African energy sector, as well as the issue of power stations and how should we increase in terms of the integrated resource plan. They didn't even go back to that. No indaba was done. The current minister right now who's running with the process of unbundling is the Minister of, public entities. And he's not even interested in the recommendations that are coming out of Parliament. So you have a massive confusion. And unfortunately, these individuals are not even power sector in experts or even people actually trained in engineering or management or even basic economics of how to run these entities. So it's a massive confusion. But the solutions are there. We have already told them what can be done to turn around Eskom. They know our presentations. They know our submissions. The Department of Energy is sitting with piles of integrated resource plan models of what should be done to make sure that Eskom becomes a functioning entity. But they are not interested in engaging. They are continuously making a mockery of South Africa on a daily basis, making pronouncements without even consulting some of the experts that are available.
So then would going solar be an alternative then in terms of taking back and considering the cost implications of solar right now? Because I think to go off the grid is about, what, 75,000 odd or something like that. But would that be an alternative? Is that a way of us to start thinking around alternative energy solutions going solar? Because this conversation happened with the issue around nuclear and then we pulled it back. Now we're saying that we're going to be looking at alternative forms of energy which are much healthier, more sustainable. We've got the power of the sun is more to sustain us for generations to come. Should we not then be considering that alternative and then therefore then have this Eskom as one source of power instead of being the monopoly source of power?
Right now, the South African energy sector is already partially privatized. 15% of energy generated in South Africa comes from what we call independent power producers, IPPs. They're already producing all the alternative sources of energy, whether it is to do with hydro, partially small hydro, and there is wind, which is windmills, and then there is solar. And in that production, there is a capacity of about 6,000 megawatts. We are at 47,000 megawatts capacity as a country. So if you do the numbers, you will see we have already overachieved our target for actually introducing solar as well as wind. And at the 6,000 megawatt, we are at the top in the world in terms of how we have made our contribution in relation to our GDP in South Africa, because we have actually overachieved the recommendations that were brought out by the Paris Climate Accord. So this whole notion of just transition and how we should be putting solar and all of those things, they are wonderful. You and I can have these beautiful discussions over coffee tables. The poor in South Africa who own houses below 50,000 rands cannot go out and put up a solar panel with an inverter and a battery pack which costs them 200,000 or 150,000. So the logic of this debate must start addressing the fundamentals. 80% South Africans are poor. They do not have even basic means. They live in RDP houses. You're telling me that they're going to be affording solar? No,
what I'm asking you is, I'm not even about the affordability. We already understand that solar is expensive. It is a solution, but it's an expensive solution. Then how then do we start making it a more economically viable solution for the poor, especially if we're seeing this issue around Eskom? Because it appears as though the issue of Eskom and the issue of Eskom's financing is not going to be going away within the next coming election. By May, we will have problems. Already the power utility has said that analysts are saying that maybe they might have been lost until April 2019. So we already have problems. How do we start making these IPPs an economically viable solution, especially for the poor who can't afford to be having privatization?
Well, that discussion you would need to have with IPPs, because the IPPs are the ones that started off at an expensive pricing that actually took over Eskom's large chunk. Over 25% of Eskom's budget went towards IPPs while they were contributing only 4%. So that is the discussion that cannot even start. I mean, you know fundamentals of business. and economics. You cannot be paying more than what you're getting in terms of value. And in this case, we've already over-subsidized the production of energy from solar as well as wind. What you need to ask a question is, what is required in South Africa in order to drive the energy sector's reliability to provide electricity? There's two models. One is called base load, the other one is called renewables energy, which is now the solar, wind, and all of the other alternatives. In there, the only most reliable is base load, coal and nuclear. Whether we like it or not, developed countries across the world, China, India, you're talking about Europe, you're talking about the US, they're all sitting on nuclear, based on nuclear as well as coal. And they have even turned their power stations to what we call new coal, which is non-polluting coal, which is called hella coal, right? This is a model. They've gone into what they call a new nuclear, which is now what you call a carbon-free, which already meets the target of the Paris Climate Agreement. So when you want to talk base load, something that gives you light, like as we are sitting here, 24 hours, non-intermittent energy, you go that route. For small scale, myself and you, our houses can be laid up with solar, or you can have a small windmill in your yard. That's not going to do much of a difference. We are small consumers. The big consumers is industries, mining, it's agriculture, it's producers in terms of industrial producers. Those producers do not depend on anything renewable. They need large-scale power generation. And for that, it can only be coal at this stage. It can only be nuclear. We have not increased on our nuclear. We have been having silly debates.
Well, we've been having political interventions on the acquisition of any form of
renewables is already introduced. It's already way above the required threshold in terms of its success in South Africa. And it has been a highly successful introduction on renewables. We already have 84 plus renewables independent power stations. We have in total already listed as well as licensed over 185 licensed IPPs. So the debate of whether it's IPP or what, you just have to understand the fundamentals. You need non-intermittent, meaning constant power flow, 24-hour cycle.
Well,
what
you've certainly managed to change South Africans' perspectives at this moment in time, and perhaps revisiting the issue around nuclear next time, this time hopefully less the political embargo that was actually introduced with it. Adele, we have to leave our conversation there this evening.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for joining us there. Giving us a really insightful perspective about how is it that we can start looking at IPPs more effectively, but most importantly, what does this issue around unbundling of Eskom actually mean? Adele and Chabeleng joining me for that conversation.